Hello, how is everyone today? Good? I am the house detective, and today I'm going to be talking about the case of the quirky Queenslander. So I am an architectural historian, which basically is a fancy way of saying that I research buildings. So I'm a historian and I specialise in researching buildings, particularly houses. They're the things that I love researching the most. I'm actually glad, so I'm sorry that Ben is sick, but I'm also glad because it gives me a bit more time to waffle on too, so I can go into a bit more detail. Hopefully I won't bore you all before David's talk. But I do also, in addition to house histories, I also do a lot of date of construction research, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's because of some Brisbane City Council planning instruments. And I also research buildings, homesteads, railway stations, precincts, a whole range of different things. And I also do some heritage consulting work. So David will talk a bit more about home later, but when a house is on the Heritage Register, if people want to make changes to it, then they come to someone like myself or David, and we can assess the work they're trying to do, provide advice on how to best do it, and then put a report together that they can submit to council or whoever's overseeing it. So that's a brief summary of all the different work I do. Of course, my favourite stuff is researching houses. I love being a detective, I love spending time in archives, I love hanging out at the State Library. So that's what I really love doing. And so what type of places do I research? Everything, every single house, and anywhere in Australia. I love all different types of homes, and here's just some examples here up on the screen. So massive mansions, tiny little cottages, post-war humble little homes, units, flats, anything, any era, any type of house. If you've just got a new house, I can research the history of the land for you. So I love it. Every house is different. It keeps me absolutely entertained. My previous record in any job was 3 years because I got very bored very easily. I've been doing this for 11 years now because every job is different, like I said. Oh, wrong way. No, sorry, this is the right one. So there's three aspects when I'm researching a house that I look at. I look at what were the circumstances that the house was built in. When was the land first subdivided? Who originally owned the land? Was it in a town? Is it an urban or a country setting? When was the street that I'm looking at created, and was it part of an estate? Was it something else? Was it an old thoroughfare? I look at those sort of the backstory behind the home. The next thing I look at is the house itself, and I look at both documentary evidence and I also look at the physical house itself and do a bit of detective work there. So I look at things like when the house was built, what's it made out of, has it been changed, has it been extended, has it been altered, that type of information, as well as looking at documentary evidence. Very rarely I'll uncover original plans or old photos, but sometimes I'm lucky enough to hit that jackpot. And then I look at the people who live there, and this is probably some of my favourite part of the work, because you uncover those incredible human stories, the quirky, the scandalous, the shocking, the downright, heartbreaking, and it's this massive rich tapestry that just captures every aspect of our history here in Queensland. And yeah, I love it. I love everything I do. It's a great job. People often tell me I've got the best job in the world, and I absolutely agree with them. So while we're talking about Queenslander houses, I thought it might be a good place to start to try and define what a Queenslander is. And the only conclusion I came to during this process is there is no one definition. It's a very vague, generic term, but I actually put the question out to my Facebook followers a little while ago, and I said, out of all these houses that I'm showing you photos of, which do you think are Queenslanders? Because I'd noticed in a lot of Facebook groups and a lot of online discussion that people were calling houses Queenslanders that I would never consider a Queenslander, and I'm like, am I wrong? What's going on here? Has the term evolved over the years to encapsulate different types of housing? So I put this post up, and I shared a number of houses. Here's some of them. So as I go through, maybe just have a look and think which ones of these you would consider a Queenslander, because we probably all have different opinions. So this was the first set, quite a varied collection. And then this was the next set. So a huge range of different types of Queensland houses, all very special, and some of them more so than others unique to Queensland. So the top two lines are what pretty much everyone agreed were Queenslanders. They would call Queenslander houses. And that's probably pretty much in line with what I would have thought. The one in the top middle is what I think of really when I first think of a Queenslander. The big wraparound verandas, that type of thing. And the two bottom ones are the ones that people were unsure about, probably 50-50. Some people said, yes, they're Queenslanders, and others argued that they weren't. Thankfully, everyone was very respectful in the discussion. No one got too angry at anyone. So basically, the overall consensus, however, was that they had to be built of timber and tin. They had to be built up on stumps. They had to have at least one veranda, and they had to be quite large. So if they were timber and tin and on stumps with a veranda, but they were only quite small, most people called them a worker's cottage instead of a Queenslander. So I would probably add to this list from a more academic perspective, I would add the fact that it's all those things, but they generally tend to have the same roof form, either a pyramid roof or a short ridge hip roof. So they differ in terms of, actually I'll go back to the photos. So if you have a look at the roof forms here, except for the bottom two, they all tend to be a pyramid, like the pyramids in Egypt, easy definition. The short ridge one, have I got an example there? Probably the one, let's see if I can use this pointer. This one here, it's got the short ridge rather than a point. So but you can see they all have a similar roof structure, whereas these ones down here are what most of you probably know, they're called gables, those triangle-y bits, that's the technical term. So these are different roof forms, and I think that's probably why a lot of people argued they weren't Queenslanders, and they're not what I would call Queenslanders, but they're still a Queensland house. You can see a house like that and go, that's built in Queensland. So it's still part of our architectural heritage. So I added a few extra things as well. More than that, they generally have a light timber frame, and it's often a single skin. Now, these are all boring technical terms, but basically single skin means that you have the stud walls, and then you just have cladding or sheeting on one side of those, so the studs are exposed. Many of you will recognise the old Queenslanders that have the cross bracing, particularly on the front veranda wall. That's what I mean by single skin. There's not cladding on either side. You can see the kind of bones of the house. So that's an important feature of a lot of the early ones, but not all Queenslander houses have that, mainly the early ones. Then that cladding is often VJ boards. Most of you would know that, vertical joint tongue and groove boards, very characteristic of our Queenslanders, aren't they? They're very characteristic. And then also the core of the house, so when you take off the verandas and you're looking at the core that has the rooms in it, generally that's a standard rectangular or square plan, often with really similar layouts, no matter where your house is built. And what I love about Queenslanders is from your massive mansions up on a big hill somewhere like Hamilton, down to your tiny little workers' cottages in Spring Hill, they're made from the same materials. They're made in the same way. They have the same features, the stumps, the verandas, the pyramid roofs. They're just slightly bigger and maybe fancier decoration like cast iron lace or something like that. So that's what I absolutely love about our Queenslanders, that there's not this huge change, and they'll have a very similar floor plan inside. They kind of have certain rules that they have to adhere to, probably up until the Federation era. Then stuff kind of starts to get a bit crazy and a bit more flexible. So that's what I would call a Queenslander house in general. It's a very broad term, and it's not really that useful in terms of describing houses, but it's a term that I think identifies how unique they are, that they're a unique style to Queensland, and I think a lot of us take it for granted. I think a lot of us assume that this is just a standard house, and I've had a lot of people, particularly from down south, come up here and go, you know, when I got here I was like, what are these shanties up on stilts? I want a solid brick house if I'm going to be spending over $1 million. I don't want some timber cabin. So I think we do take it for granted, and obviously I say Queenslander, they spread obviously south into New South Wales as well, but whenever I don't know about you, but whenever I see like an ad on TV or something and they've used a Queensland house, you can tell straight away that it's set in Queensland. And I think we need to all appreciate them a lot more. They're amazing homes. So how do we protect these amazing homes? Well, a lot of you will know there's a couple of different ways we can do it. The main way is by heritage listing them. And I'll talk a bit more about each of these processes in a minute. The other way is through local planning instruments. So this is things like Brisbane City Council City Plan, which introduces a few protections for older houses. And I'll talk very quickly about this. It's really dry and boring, so if you want to know more information about it, you can certainly search online. And I actually did a YouTube video on it recently, the different types of heritage listing, because there's different levels all the way from World Heritage Listing all the way down to local and specific organisational listings. But what I'm going to talk about today is the Queensland Heritage Register and local government heritage lists or statutory requirements. So in Brisbane, it's the Brisbane City Council City Plan. But every major town will have some kind of heritage list in general. So the local planning instrument, this Brisbane City Plan, it has two main things that protect our older homes in Brisbane, and this is what's called the Traditional Building Character Overlay. And when I say overlay, it's similar to a Heritage Register list, but instead of a static list, it's actually a mapping overlay. It's tied to mapping, and that's how it's like a visual way of doing it. And when anyone does development on a particular property, that overlay is then flagged and tied to that lot on a map, if that makes sense. Probably not. Anyway, so the idea between the Traditional Building Character Overlay is to protect houses that were built before 1947. And it's an idea that relates more to protecting streetscapes as opposed to individual buildings like heritage listing does. So it's designed to, in general, try and protect an entire row of, say, timber and tin houses or something like that. That's the general idea behind it. So it's not council saying you can't do anything to these places. It's council saying if you do want to do something, we want to have a say in it and we want to have a look at what you're doing. In theory, any new development on the street or alterations to these houses should protect what the front of the houses at least look like. I have seen this done really well. I've seen it done really badly, to the point where they might as well just have demolished the house and built a new one. So it's a bit hit and miss. But that's a general overview of that. The other planning instrument is protection on pre-1911 homes. Now, why pre-1911? Completely arbitrary date. They started discussing bringing in this legislation in 2011 and they went, let's make it 100 years, houses that are over 100 years old. So completely arbitrary. It doesn't mean a house built in 1910 is amazing and significant and one built in 1912 isn't. It's just a general date that they chose to settle on. So this, in theory, offers a bit more protection to houses that are built before that date. In theory, it stops them being demolished, but under certain circumstances, you can relocate them to other sites, which is unfortunately what happens a lot. And most of the time, you might as well demolish them because they're taken out of their original context. But anyway, that's a rant for another day. So so we've got the three main protections there: the heritage listing, either at a state or a local government level, and then you've got planning instruments like this that are basically whenever anyone wants to make changes on a place, these will come up as a red flag, and they'll have a different assessment process. And then they'll call heritage professionals in. The owners will have to call heritage professionals in to help them do those applications, or town planners to help them do those applications. So that's a general overview. Now, how do we choose what places are going to go on a heritage register? A lot of us might think that ideally every single old house would be protected and added to a register, and that's something that I used to think as well. But if we do that, you then have the situation where houses aren't being updated to meet our modern living requirements. So if you imagine we couldn't update a house to, I don't know, for example, run USB ports or something through the house, or modern requirements, put downlighting or whatever in that people want to do, then there's going to be a point where the houses become unlivable because they're just relics and no one wants to live there and they're going to sit empty and decay. So we need to have some change and some modernisation of our old building stock, some infill development to fit all the people that are living here. But basically what the Heritage Register is about is picking some of the best examples that represent different elements of our history or different elements of significance and protecting those ones. That's in theory. There's a lot of things that are on the State Heritage Register, for example, that probably don't meet the current criteria because they were added in the past, but that's basically how the process goes these days. There's 8 different criteria for the State Heritage Register, and I've got them up in a lot of detail here, but don't worry about taking them in. And it will be a similar criteria for local heritage registers, sometimes a few less criteria, but instead of being important to the state of Queensland, it'll be important to the local area. So essentially, heritage places are any place that help tell the story of a particular aspect of our history. If it's on the Queensland Heritage Register, it has to help tell the story of the history of Queensland. So it has to be important to the entire state. If it's on the Brisbane City Council Heritage Register, it has to help tell the story of Brisbane's history or an aspect of Brisbane's history. So that's a very quick summary of heritage listing. So basically, in summary, I've broken it down to be a little bit more simple and less detailed than the slide before. Does it help tell the history of where we've come from, some aspect of our past? Is it a rare example of a particular type of housing? Is it the only surviving example of a prefabricated concrete house or something like that? If we pull it apart or dig up the backyard, is there potential there to reveal information about some aspect of our history? So, for example, was the house built on the site of a former manufacturing plant or something like that, where if we dug up the backyard, we might find archaeological evidence of this amazing industry that would add to our knowledge of Queensland history or the local area's history? Is it a perfect, intact example of a style of house? Now, David's going to be talking a little bit about home up at Kangaroo Point, which was mentioned, and that is a perfect and beautiful example of a Federation-era home. So something like that where it epitomises a particular style or a particular era of housing. And then the next one is, does it look good? Well, that's a bit subjective. Is it visually striking, I think is the term we used to use when we're doing the listing, a little bit less personalised. So is it pretty to look at? For example, the State Library building here, it's a brutalist design. Not everyone likes it. It's concrete. It was, particularly when built, it was very stark and harsh, but that is still of an aesthetic style. That's still important aesthetically because it's so striking and because it's a landmark. So it doesn't have to be what we all consider pretty. It's just something that is visually, has a visual impact, I guess, one way or the other, if that makes sense. And that can apply to houses too, obviously. And was it a clever design or an innovative design, or did it use an innovative technique? So, for example, and one point I was going to make too, it doesn't have to be an old place. So if someone was to do the first 3D printed house in Queensland, for example, that's something that could almost be listed straight away, because that would be a technological achievement and an innovative design. And so I mentioned also like a prefabricated concrete house or something like that. That's something that can also meet that criteria. Something clever, something that's not been done before, something that is unique. So the next one, this one is less about the fabric and design of the house itself and more about the connection of the house to a particular group or a group of people. So was it, for example, somewhere, maybe the Country Women's Association, for example, have used this particular house for their purposes for 100 years, and it's just a boring old plain house, but it's because it helps tell the story of that organisation that's important to Queensland, that the house now has significance. Or it could be a building where there was a First Nations land rights protest held. The building itself is not of importance from an architectural or fabric perspective, but because of this connection it has with a cultural group, it then has its own importance and can help tell part of the story of Queensland's history. Finally, another one, the final criteria is a similar one. Does it help tell the story of a particular person or organisation? So things that might fall into this category would be if it was the house of someone famous, a premier's house, something like that. Some normally rich dead white guys, I'm going to be honest, that's normally whose house makes it on the register. I'd like to change that, but that kind of thing, something that has a connection to someone very important in our past history, or for example, an architect's own house design, something like that. So in a nutshell, that's the heritage criteria we look for. So you can see you're trying to cherry pick good examples that represent particular aspects of our history. So, in summary, you can see from that list that I've just said, it doesn't have to be old. So like I said, in theory, there's nothing stopping a brand new building being listed, although I think you'd have a fair bit of trouble arguing that point and getting it across the line, because I think we do need that perspective of distance a bit to determine what's important in some ways. It definitely doesn't have to be a Queenslander house. It doesn't have to be a pretty old house. It doesn't even have to be a building. It can be a landscape, a park. In theory, I know overseas they have things like sounds on a heritage register. So one I would like to see added to the register, for example, is the sound of the Brisbane City Hall. That would be something that you could add to the heritage listing for that, because it's so important and so many people remember that throughout their lives. And it also doesn't have to be something you can see. It can be an archaeological site, for example. So I think from memory, one of the archaeological sites on the register, the state register, is one of the Burke and Wills sites, where they know there was a camp there and there's potential to find archaeology there, but we're not sure for certain, but we protect that site from development just in case. So that's a very quick overview. But of course, houses are my favourite thing on the heritage register. There's a huge range of places on there, and I love trawling through the list of heritage registered places. And the thing I like about houses is that, yes, they tell the story of our architectural history, but as I mentioned, they tell the story of the people who lived there. And in the process of researching them, I delve into the social history, what was going on at that time. Women were stuck in the home. They were generally meant to marry and then serve their husbands. You know, the story, the history of our world wars are captured. Some of the houses I researched were built under returned servicemen schemes, that type of thing. The social history of social housing, where particularly after the Second World War, there was so many houses built, affordable housing being built for people. I love thinking, what can we take from that and use now to the housing crisis we have? I look into all these amazing different stories and uncover some amazing characters. So many times there's people I come across and I think, I wish I could have met you in real life, because you just sound like the biggest character. So it's great. And I uncover these stories via researching houses that would never come up otherwise, particularly the stories of women, because they're often not captured well in history. And sometimes I'll come across these amazing women. I know I'm starting to rant now. I've had a lot of coffee, can you tell? I will let David speak eventually, I promise. So I'm researching a house at Corinda, and this incredible woman's story I uncovered, who basically bought it as her townhouse, but she ran a property out near Birdsville in Western Queensland. After her husband died, she just kept running the property in the early 1900s, almost unheard of for that era for a woman to do that. Did it very successfully. Took the Queensland government to court over a battle over her stock. Like, these incredible women whose stories you wouldn't generally come across, except I happen to be researching their house. And it's a name on a title, a property title, and then I fill in all the details around it. It's amazing. So, what's my favourite Queensland house? No surprises. How convenient. David's going to be talking about this too. But this has been my favourite house in Brisbane for a long, long time, and I think a lot of people feel the same way. And I was saying to David earlier how I used to drive past and want to cry when I saw what condition it is in, and now I drive past with a big smile on my face because it's absolutely beautiful. It's been restored perfectly. So in terms of heritage listing, this one's on the State Heritage Register, and it would tick a number of criteria. As I said, it's a beautiful example of a Federation-era home. It's also designed by a very well-known architect in Queensland, Alexander B. Wilson. It's an early house, and it's within the Federation era. And it's one of the best designs, as I said. It's exquisite craftsmanship inside and out, and you would have seen that if you've seen any of the photos or the Restoration Australia episode on that. It's amazing. But it's not timber and tin. It's not your standard Queenslander, is it? But it's still an amazing Queensland home. But what's my dream home? A lot of people expect that it would be something like home, but no. I actually love mid-century modern homes. They're my favourite. That's what I would want to live in. So this house, now let's just have a look at some of the criteria here and see if you think it would meet the criteria for heritage listing. Designed by Peter Heathwood, very well-known post-war Queensland architect. Built in 1967. Built for Bert and Vera Teese. Now, Bert was one of the original Teese brothers. It's now the biggest mining services supply company in the world. So he's connected to a very well-known business. He was a very well-known person, founded here in Queensland, that business. It's one of the most, well, it was one of the best and most intact examples of mid-century modern housing design in Queensland. It was, I think it was 2016 when I first visited it. It was absolutely as intact as the day it was built. Not a thing had been changed. It was full of bespoke built-in furniture that had been designed for the house. It had artworks in it. It would have been the epitome of luxury for 1967. Some of you would remember the Marta Prize homes. Do you remember those old ones? And you would just look at them and just think, do people really live like, well, I would anyway. I'd look at it and go, do people really live like this? Oh my God. And this is the epitome of luxury along those lines. It had a swimming pool, but it also had a big entertainment area, which we take for granted now. Most houses, big grand houses will have it, but quite innovative for the time. But by mid-century modern, I mean the low, sleek look, lots of glass, designed to have passive ventilation to cool the home, that type of thing. But you can see from the photos that it was just absolutely an amazing example. And I think, I don't know if you'll agree with me from what I read at the start, that it would have met the criteria for heritage listing on paper. It ticked all the boxes, and a perfect example, an intact example, an unusual example. It's connected to a well-known person in Queensland history. However, in the process of me nominating it, it was partially demolished, and it's now been converted into a sales centre for the massive townhouse development that's going to go there. So I actually sat in my car and cried when I went past and that had happened to it. So my point, the point of this whole rant is we need to also be thinking about what our heritage homes of the future are going to be. What are we going to wish we'd heritage listed so that there's surviving examples for time for people in the future to have a look at? And I think we don't necessarily value our post-war architecture, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We don't value that very much at the moment, but people in the future will. Like most of us of a certain age can remember firsthand what those homes looked like, but in the future there'll be a time when no one knows what an 80s house looked like to walk into and experience. And I'm noticing a lot with a lot of the younger demographic that follow my social media, they love these houses. They absolutely love these houses and are converting their homes into homes that look like this. So it's definitely changing. And I mean, we need to remember too, there's a time where our beautiful old Queenslanders, people thought they were so daggy and old and horrendous, and they put the orange brick facades on them. Have you seen those? They're fantastic, aren't they? But you know, they change and evolve over time, and our tastes change. And I think we need to be thinking about what we're listing now to make sure we're capturing a representative example of all our architecture. So that's the end of that rant as well. So I just want to leave you with that thought. What places should we be putting on the Heritage Register now that represent Queensland houses now? Thank you. Thanks for listening. And just because I'm me, I'm going to do a shameless plug. So I've got a lot of case studies of houses I've researched on my website if you want to have a look. And I also am on YouTube and social media if you want to follow along in my adventures. And as a special deal for you special people today, I have just some discount cards if you would, or you know anyone, or you would like me to research your house for you. So that's just a special deal for all of you today. Thank you.